Eric Common, who's on tonight, has really been doing a great job of doing more for us on social media. So we appreciate all that you've been sharing, Eric, as new resources and things are coming out. And I know most of you already know this, but if you are not aware, we've had the opportunity to be in a randomized control trial and do another large scale study as part of this project that we have across multiple sites. And all the new resources that have been developed, such as those that you are working with now, become fully available to the public on 6/24/2024. So on that day, it is a Monday, and it's at the end of June, and we will be hosting a Ci3T implementation symposium, and Elise leads this with Stacy. And very excited. The whole focus is going to be on two objectives. It's all going to be about how do you use these resources to do long-range planning for your school or district. And then the second thing is, how do I start in those first few days with adults and with kids? So as you're listening to some of the stuff that we're going to visit about today, working at Tier 2, I just want you to know that this is just like dipping a little toe, and all the resources will be available to you in a larger scale and with some continued support. We've also recently had several people ask us, what's next year going to look like? And the good news is that by mid-February, we will share all the details about what will be happening. And then there'll be a second layer if the grants that are under review right now also fund. But for tonight, let's celebrate the fact that we get the gift of each other's time today. If you would, in the chat, Eric has been dropping in a link so that you can go to this part of the website. It's the Enhanced tab. And in the red letters and symbols at the top, you can grab the password. And this hasn't changed since the last time you were here. When you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that page, that is where you're going to see the light blue accordion folders on the right-hand side, and we're at session 4. So if you would like any of these, just as a reminder, these are editable, and you are, again, welcome to pull these resources out and share as you see fit. Today, what Mark and I are going to get a chance to do is we're going to give you an overview a little bit about Tier 2 within a Ci3T system. And then we're going to focus on two interventions. One is behavior contracts, and one is an academic intervention. It's SRSD for writing. And this is builds on some of the work that Wendy and I got to do together when she was at Vanderbilt. And I want to say up front, we picked these two to feature today. These are different than what we shared out last year with you. Behavior contracts can be for anything. It could be for improving academic performance. It could be like getting work completed. It could be contracting for time spent engaged in reading. It could be social interactions, like to initiate contact with friends on the playground. It could be showing up at school. It could be using more positive self-talk to manage anxious feelings. So it can encompass all of those pieces. So we emphasize that on something that's integrated. And SRSD for writing is self-regulated strategy development for writing. SRSD is a broader set of strategies. And in our conversations, we know that many districts are struggling and classroom teachers to figure out, like, how do I teach writing? This is not a comprehensive writing curriculum in terms of like something that's going to go from start to finish. It's all strategy instruction, super, super practical. And so we're going to show you in both of these modules how you can get started with this. But SRSD for writing, we're going to focus on the strategy piece of it. And I just want to give you a little heads up that if you think, oh gosh, this sounds interesting, but I don't know if I'd have time to get into it. The nice thing is all the lessons are already made for every single strategies. There's scope and sequences. This goes from elementary all the way to high school. And it meets What Works Clearinghouse standards for an evidence-based practice. And usually districts will build out a scope and sequence to say, like, I'm going to teach this strategy in, first grade, this one in second, this one in third. So keep an eye on that. And then we'll give you a little bit of time to explore a few other resources. But where you're looking right now is where people have been invited to attend tonight, because this is just for people that are taking place in part of Project Enhance. And we did a similar content not using these modules a couple of days ago. And I would say, I think we had probably close to 50 to 60 people. So as this scales up next year, this will all reduce to just one series. So what it'll look like next year will be a larger group of people. There'll probably be closer to 100 people each time. And I mention that to you now because all of this will become available to everybody. So we will very shortly, by mid-February, have all the dates for when all the Empower sessions are for next year. I would encourage you to put them into your My Learning plan, distribute those. Some districts do it where they encourage 2 people or 3 people per school. And for now, we're just going to take a moment to situate ourselves to explain what Tier 2 looks like within a Ci3T structure, focusing on that ideas of integration and focusing on the ideas of intensity. So Mark, thanks for taking us to the next step.
So yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. We're really excited to have this time to talk about Tier 2 interventions in Ci3T. In a little bit, we'll get to the actual specific interventions, but for now, let's just kind of start with sort of the basics. So, of course, before we talk about Tier 2, the real place to start is Tier 1. So, of course, you're working in schools or working in districts that are implementing Ci3T. And of course, Ci3T has those 3 big areas: academics, behavior, and social and emotional well-being. And the purpose of Tier 1 is really to get effective practices to all students and to make sure that we're meeting as many needs as we can through really good programming that's not just targeting one or the other, but rather all 3 of these domains in a way that's well integrated, meaning that we bring in social and emotional skills into our academic instruction. We make those behavioral expectations part of the classroom and school culture. And we're finding connections between what we're learning about in terms of academic skills, as far as like what that means for us in terms of our social and emotional well-being. So really working to address the whole child, the whole student, in the context of this Tier 1 experience, which is going to reach all students, hopefully. So that's our basis. And in thinking about all those things that go into Tier 1, we always want to come back to what your individual school's plan has in it. So each of you have either one or multiple school Ci3T implementation manuals that's going to document in a pretty detailed fashion everything that's going to go into supporting students across all the tiers. But since we're starting with Tier 1, let's just kind of take a jump into what that looks like. So one of the things you would find in your school Ci3T implementation manual is a list of faculty and staff roles and responsibilities that breaks down across those 3 big domains what kinds of practices and procedures we're going to hopefully put in place for all students to support them. So one example of that is when providing academic instruction, how can we use low intensity teacher-delivered supports to make sure that we're maximizing student engagement and reducing the chance that challenging behavior will occur. So those low intensity supports are things like instructional choice, behavior-specific praise, active supervision, and pre-correction, just to name a few. And hopefully supporting staff and feeling confident with how to use those in a manner that's going to really make instruction fast-paced, engaging, and well-aligned to students' interests, using things like instructional choice. And so keep in mind that those kind of sound like behavioral interventions or behavioral strategies, but you find them in the academic column here. And that's very intentional. And it's one illustration of how we're taking this integrated approach to thinking about providing supports to students, because we know that just teaching, content, it's never as simple as that. The way that we teach the content is the way that we make students have the environment that's going to invite their engagement. And so thinking about how those strategies can really promote engagement is a critical aspect for how we conceptualize instruction. And then with behavior at Tier 1, we've got school-wide expectations, we've got a universal reinforcement system. We also have a very intentional way of responding when challenging behavior occurs. Because challenging behavior doesn't have a tier, right? All challenging behavior isn't Tier 2 or Tier 3. Sometimes anyone can struggle, or anyone might have a difficult day or a circumstance that brings out some behavior that's not really well aligned to classroom expectations. And so when that happens, we've got clear and kind ways to respond to those behaviors using something like a reactive plan that might list a 6-step instructional approach for responding to challenging behavior. If you're not familiar with that 6-step instructional approach, we won't go into detail on that tonight, but it's a great tool to have in your toolkit, and we'll show you some resources where you could go and find out more about those 6 steps and what that looks like. Now, at the social and emotional level, each of you has a program that you're teaching at Tier 1. It might be positive action, character strong, 2nd step, caring school communities. There's a ton of different programs out there. a lot of which have really good evidence to suggest that they can help students achieve these social and emotional skills. And actually, interestingly, some of the research shows that kids that are more adept socially and emotionally do better academically, which is really cool because basically these things become academic enablers. Kids that have really good social skills can learn more because they know how to collaborate with peers, they know how to problem solve, they know how to be goal directed. So these are really critical skills, and they're not just hanging out in the social and emotional domain, they thread through all of those domains as well. And so as we're thinking about how to make sure that tier one instruction, which, sometimes it's a little bit hard to find time during the school day to teach, or sometimes we don't love the lessons, or sometimes it's just not quite comfortable yet to have these conversations. But making that commitment to find a way to make it work is really important because regardless of how we get there, we know that those skills are absolutely critical, and using those programs is one of our best bets to achieve that. And then within all of that, we want to make sure that we have solid procedures for teaching. Part of that is just teaching ourselves how to use the strategies and programs really effectively. So doing things like coming to a session tonight for professional development is a great way to teach ourselves more strategies and skills. But we also have procedures for teaching students as well, like teaching them school-wide expectations or following those academic program guidelines for how much reading to teach and all those other content areas. We've also got procedures for reinforcing, using things like behavior-specific praise. And again, not just for our students, but also with our colleagues, and praising the efforts of our families and community members in terms of their engagement as well. So really thinking about how this impacts all of the groups of people that are working together to make this work. And then lastly, making sure that we have good data to look at to inform whether we think things are working or not, whether academic achievement levels are shifting over time, whether we're implementing practices as planned, and we'll kind of unpack some of those data sources over the course of the night. But we always want to keep that data-informed aspect in front of us. So as we're kind of thinking about what tier one looks like, again, to build that base to work up to an understanding of what tier two should look like, one of the really critical aspects that I mentioned before is that idea of integration. So making sure that we're not just siloing things, and here's my academic instruction, here are my behavior management skills, here's my social and emotional, curriculum that I'm going to teach twice a week, and kind of leave it at that. The goal is to really make a close weaving together of all of these aspects of our instruction to really make it come alive for students and to keep all of those pieces really coming back to the forefront for kids. And so one of the tools that we have that we recommend consideration is called an integrated lesson plan. That's mostly meant as an illustration for how to go about planning lessons that are going to capitalize on all those resources that you've got at your disposal. So you wouldn't necessarily fill this out for every lesson that you're going to teach throughout the course of a week, but you might use it for one to help you kind of be really mindful and planful for how to make sure that we're doing the work of integration and that we're finding ways to bring together learning objectives that aren't just academic skills, but also our social, emotional, and behavioral as well. How to weave in those low intensity supports to promote engagement and hopefully prevent disruptive behaviors as well. And then the last piece, as I mentioned before, is that procedures for monitoring piece, where we're going to be looking at data at tier one. Those three big data sources that we tend to talk about are social validity, treatment integrity, and systematic screening. And I want to just spend a moment with those kind of as vocabulary words to kind of get some familiarity and comfort with those, because they're going to keep cropping up as we talk about these tier two and tier three interventions. The reason being that there are kind of three fundamental aspects for how we decide if something is working and how we can troubleshoot if something isn't working as designed or as hoped for. So social validity means, do people feel positively about the goals of an intervention or a plan or a program? Do people feel like it's achieving its intended outcomes? So goals, and do people feel like the procedures are reasonable to implement? So social validity is a big issue. And we tend to think about social validity from the teacher perspective at tier one. How do my colleagues feel about tier one practices? But we're going to really get into the social validity of tier two interventions tonight, which is really, really important. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about why here coming up. But before we do that, we're going to talk about treatment integrity. Treatment integrity is, am I implementing this plan or program as intended? Which is pretty simply thought of as adherence. Do I have an idea of what this should look like, and am I adhering to that? But we can also think about dosage, like am I giving enough of this to people to achieve the intended outcome? And am I thinking about it in terms of how people are responding to it as well? And then lastly, we're going to think about screening data. And we'll unpack this here actually in just a minute, where we're going to look at screening data to figure out what are the current levels of performance across academics and behavior of all students. And we're going to use those data to help us decide, A, as a whole school, how are we progressing? Are we seeing lower levels of risk in certain areas and higher levels of risk in other areas? But we're also going to use those data to figure out which kids need extra supports. And that's particularly important as we get into Tier 2, which is the main topic for tonight. So speaking of Tier 2, in your Ci3T implementation manual, you should find probably about halfway through, maybe 2/3 of the way through, some tables. We call them grids. And these are called the secondary intervention grids. And what it is a catalog of different interventions that you have available to you in your school to provide to students who have Tier 2 needs. We're going to talk more about what kinds of information is on those grids here in just a moment, but you would also find similar grids for Tier 3 as well. We call them the tertiary or Tier 3 intervention grids. Again, think about it like a catalog. And when you're thinking about students who might need extra supports beyond Tier 1, it's basically a place to go shopping and to say, okay, what does this child need? What are the data sources telling me in terms of what this child needs? Let's go find an intervention or maybe a few interventions that meet that sort of profile or suggestion of what that child needs based on what the data are telling us. So those are our 3 levels of prevention: Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. We're going to make sure that we're really using data to help us decide, when students may have Tier 2 needs or Tier 3 needs. We don't just want to go with our gut, right? Our gut instincts are really important, and they're going to definitely lead us oftentimes down fruitful pathways. But we always want to make sure that we have some good data to rely on so that we can make reliable and valid decisions. So one of the one of the data sources that you have available to you is behavior screening data, such as using the Student Risk Screening Scale for Internalizing and Externalizing Behaviors, or SRSSIE. And this is going to help us to break down at multiple levels, like what is the level of risk in our school. So right now you're looking at an example graph of multiple years of screening data from the winter time point for students externalizing behaviors at the middle school level. And so we can see, like, more recently, we've kind of got this dip in the number of students whose needs are being met by Tier 1. And that's going to tell us something about, hey, like maybe we need to ramp up our Tier 1 programming a little bit. And then as we go to the next slide, we're going to see the similar results, but for internalizing behaviors. So this is for students who might have more withdrawn or anxious behaviors. And student or behavior screening data broadly is critical for finding kids that have these type of needs, because unlike students that are engaging in acting out behaviors, those kids often are getting office discipline referrals or showing up in other ways in our data set. Kids that are anxious sometimes kind of slide under the radar. But we absolutely need to prioritize these students' needs and figure out how we can support them in a proactive manner. And oftentimes without screening data that'll help us kind of pick up on which kids might have these kinds of needs, it's hard to find them based on other data sources. So that really highlights the importance of having these systematic screening data. So those are our Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So I'm going to show you a brief little preview of some of the materials that we'll be looking at tonight. Right here, you're looking at an image of a CrossFit gym. And so you've got the wrong person talking to you right now, because this is totally Kathleen's thing, not necessarily mine. But this is signifying to me that we're going to take a look at this little video that you can find on some of our online materials. So this is an example of what one of our enhancing Ci3T modules look like. And this video that I'm going to show you that kind of gives you an overview of what Tier 2 is and is not is contained right here on this module. So this module is called the Tier 2 process. It's not one of the modules we're going way deep into tonight, but it does give you some really good information about how to think about Tier 2 and some practice at using data sources to connect students to supports. So what you'll find in all of our modules is if you go to the overview page and scroll down just a little bit, you find these really nice tables of contents. Something you're going to find tonight is that you have access to an incredible treasure trove of different resources, so much so that it's almost a little bit overwhelming. And so if you're ever like, I know I need to go find this certain checklist or this certain resource, but I know what module it's in, but not quite where to find it. Always check out these tables of contents, because they kind of give you a list of everything that's available. So right now, what we want to find is this tier 2 CrossFit analogy video, which I'm going to play for you right now before we start jumping into our next section.
When I think about tier 2, I think about it in terms of intensity. Several years ago, I'm 53 now, and several years ago, before my son went to college, I cleared my calendar for his senior year, and I'm like, good news, bud, we're going to hang out. Yeah, I know, shocking, right? He didn't want to hang out. So I thought, okay, that one's kind of a throwaway. So then I thought, Katie, she's younger, and you'll meet her tonight at the poster session. So 5 years ago, I'm like, honey, I know you're getting ready to go to college in a few years. I want as much time with you as possible. Let's do something together. Let's like go to yoga. And she's like, Mom, no offense, yoga's kind of for old ladies. I'm like, okay, shots fired, whatever. So I'm like, how about Zumba? So we go to Zumba. And I think I'm fairly stunning at that moment. And she walks out and she's like, that can never, ever, ever happen again. She's like, if you want to hang out with me, you're welcome to come to the gym. And she is a CrossFitter. So first day, I do what every mom does. I suit up, I show up, and I think I know what I'm doing. I wear really dark sweats, a big sweatshirt, and a t-shirt. First activity is jump rope. Let me pause right there. I'm 48 years old at the time, and I've had 2 children. Feel me? So after that, this guy, the coach, says, all right, before the next activity, anybody who needs to use the restroom, feel free to do it now. It was a little bit late. We should have taught him about pre-corrects. The next movement was chest to bars. And so she's over there doing chest to bars on the rig. And he's like, now he knows my athletic ability. He says, come here, Kathleen. And he puts this rubber band. So I get in this rubber band on the rig, and still nothing's happening. So he's like, 2. You need 2 rubber bands. I'm like, and now it's like a miracle. My chin is over the bar. I'm an athlete. The next thing is he's like, all right, guys, let's jump into some handstand push-ups. And I'm like, seriously? So he's like, hey, grab this box. And he's like, I want you to lay on this box and go like this. And I'm like, well, what's that mat for? He's like, this is normally an abdominal mat, but that's to protect your head in case you lose control. And I'm like, okay, great. And realistically, these are not tier 2 supports. For me, they're really tier 3. But my point is, they kept me in that room. I didn't feel embarrassed. It's not like they said, you peed on yourself in the warm-up, you can't stay. I got to be included. And I will tell you, at the end of my first year of CrossFit, my daughter entered me into a competition, and I won 3rd place. Thank you. Because there were 3 in my age range. And I stood on that podium. It was an awesome moment, and I definitely had more cellulite than anybody in that room combined, but it didn't matter. And I tell you this because, to me, that's what tier 2 should be about. That's what we should all commit to, is empowering all teachers to know what the tools are that they can be empowered with. It's putting the rubber bands, the boxes, the ab mats, all the pre-corrects so that we don't have accidents. And I'm not saying it will manage every single kid's every support every time, but my goal would be, at the end of my life, would be that there's a free access screening tool from preschool to high school, and that every school would have the opportunity to put in comprehensive, integrated, 3-tiered models of prevention. And the thing that inspires me every day are the people that I work with. I have the best students, the best colleagues. I am super thankful. And at the end, I hope that every kid feels valued and welcomed. And I want to make sure every kid leaves school strong and ready to do next steps.
Okay, so I'm trying to get myself out of video mode here. The reason I show you that is twofold. One, it's an incredibly eloquent and straightforward explanation of what tier 2 is and is not, right? Tier 2 is a way to help meet all students' needs that everyone can be a part of. Tier 2 is not an intervention group that the child gets sent out of the classroom to go do someplace else. So I think that kind of sets our baseline expectation and understanding for what tier 2 is. But also, if you're here tonight and you're like, I want to bring some Kathleen Lane energy to my school, I need her to come explain tier 2 to my colleagues and coworkers, that video is part of the modules that you have access to. So if you wanted to share that with someone that you work with, or even your entire faculty and staff, that's totally an option to you. So you can go and find that video if you're kind of having the tier 2 conversation with your folks at school. That's a great resource for you to use. So we know that tier 2 is necessary. We've got to have interventions that we can use for kids that need extra help. They don't need special education. They don't need intensive intervention, but they need a boost. They need something. So what we need to do is think about how to create a library of interventions and resources to help us learn how to implement those interventions that can be accessed by everybody that needs it. That's not just interventionists, it's not just special education teachers, it's general education teachers, maybe even paraprofessionals, maybe people that work in a lunchroom as non-instructional aides, things that everybody can participate in to help meet those students' needs who just need a little bit of extra support. So as we're thinking about tonight, think about this as one step in the direction of helping establish some expertise in your school in implementing Tier 2 interventions. If you're a classroom teacher, all the better. Now you will know how to put some of these in place in your classroom, and we're hoping that you can share that information with your colleagues as well. So as we're looking at professional learning resources tonight, like the module that we just looked at, on ci3t.org/enhance, which is accessible by clicking the Project Enhance button at the top of our website. You can go to a super secret, password protected part of our website where all these modules and resources live. The password is right here on your screen. It's enhanced Ci3T ! I know my colleague Eric is putting and has put that into the chat and will continue to do so to make sure that you can get into that website. And we would really encourage you to do that now, to pull up your web browser and go ahead and sign into that page of the website so that you can kind of ride along with us as we're going through some of these resources. And just know that you can share what you learn here tonight with anybody that works in your school, can totally learn from what you're learning here tonight. So definitely link up with your colleagues and share this with them as well. When you get signed into any given module, you'll find that the jumping off point looks like this little infographic that you're seeing on your screen right here. Where you end up to start is called an ebook. And the ebook has everything that you need to know about this topic, including a ton of embedded resources, which include videos, infographics, forms, checklists, you name it. You'll also find an interactive resource version of modules as well. So if you're more of a kick back and watch PD rather than read PD kind of person, which that's totally me, the interactive resource gives you all the same information, but in a multimedia format. It's almost like watching a video, but it's better than a video because it'll pause strategically, it'll ask you some questions, and you can click on various parts on the screen to download the same infographics that you'd be able to access in the ebook. So 2 different pathways to get the same information. If you prefer the ebook version, it's kind of nice because it has this cool little overview on the left-hand side of the screen where you can kind of skip around straight to what you need. And then that overview table of contents gives you everything that you might want for that topic. So really powerful, really flexible, and just loaded down with things that you can use and share with people as you like. And so when you go to that Enhance page of our website, you'll find a bunch of different module containers. They're like buckets of information. We've got one on Tier 2, we've got one on low intensity strategies, we've got one for leaders, but we're going to be leaning straight into this Tier 2 intervention group of modules. And specifically, we're going to get started by looking at the behavior contracts. And so as we're thinking about Tier 2, that module that I showed you previously, the Tier 2 process, is really helpful if you've got folks that are maybe a little, we'll call them data anxious, right? It's really easy to get overwhelmed with all the data that you might have available in your school. And then you're trying to figure out what these intervention grids are. And it's like, where do I even start? This module is a great place to start in just trying to figure out the logistics of how do I look at data and figure out which kids need supports and go from collecting data all the way through to intentionally supporting students based on their individual needs. So for example, in this module, you'll find an explanation of the intervention grids, which we'll take a look at tonight. You'll find a video and a bunch of embedded resources that basically give you practice data, like a data dashboard, basically, that's in Google Drive. And you can actually make a copy of this into your own drive and practice filtering, sorting, making pretend intervention groups, making integrated intervention decisions. You can do a lot of things with this like practice hypothetical data set. And the video that I showed you before actually gives you some ideas and examples for some of the other tools you can use to actually connect these kids to individual supports, which is pretty cool. And we've also got some other resources there as well to help teach folks how to use those data to do data-informed decision-making. So as an example, you're looking at an example Tier 2 intervention grid for self-monitoring, which is another really, really good evidence-based Tier 2 intervention. And once we start thinking about students and their needs, we need to know like what the interventions are. So every intervention grid is going to contain a very brief description of that support. It's going to talk about some of the data that can be used to connect that students to supports. Oftentimes it's going to be using academic and behavioral screening. It's going to talk about what kinds of progress monitoring data need to be collected. And oftentimes progress monitoring can feel a little bit overwhelming for people at first because it's like, what kind of data do I collect? How do I collect it? And the great news is that the module resources we're going to share tonight have all of that information inserted right into it. So you won't have to come up with any data collection schemes. Everything from the forms to the database to the analysis of those data is all prepackaged and ready to go. And then lastly, how do we figure out when students don't need the intervention anymore, or potentially when they need to go up to a more intensive intervention? So there's going to be exit criteria as well. So an example of what this might look like in action is you've got some interventions like self-monitoring, you've got data, and then we want to start looking at our data to figure out, okay, who might this intervention be a good fit for? So here you're looking at students in a hypothetical class that have externalizing needs that are highlighted in yellow and red for tier 2 and tier 3 needs, or moderate or high risk. We've got academic skills represented here as well. And so you can think about this almost like a spreadsheet. And a lot of you have applications in your district right now that would let you do this kind of activity, where you're kind of drilling down to look at certain groups of students based on their needs. So for example, in this little video that you're watching here, we're looking at kids that have moderate risk for externalizing. It's going to loop through one more time. Moderate risk for externalizing. So these are a handful of kids in yellow here. And then we're also going to look for kids that have some challenges in reading as well. So these are going to be students that have moderate risk for reading. The purpose of doing this, of looking at the data in this fashion, is we might be saying, okay, we could definitely support kids that have that behavioral risk, but what are we going to do to help make sure that those behaviors don't impact any intervention that they might get for reading as well, for example? And so thinking about how we can thread behavioral supports through academic supports and use them to support each other is a really important facet of our data-informed decision-making. And two, just thinking about simple things like attendance. If you've got students that are missing a ton of school, it's really hard to use tier 2 interventions to support those students, because at the foundation, if kids aren't at school, they're missing instruction, they don't have the consistency that's really needed to find a lot of comfort and success at school. That might be the place to start rather than jumping straight into a behavioral support. So that really shows why it's important to look at multiple data sources so that we're not missing out on things. So there's tons of interventions that are available, and one of those that we're going to lean into tonight is behavior contracts. So we have an entire module that's dedicated to behavior contracts, and what we're going to do in this next section is to kind of walk you through, it's like a mini training on behavior contracts, but it's also going to connect you to let you know what kinds of resources are available to you to learn more about behavior contracts and to actually go and implement it in your class or your school. This is the cover for the behavior contracts module. As I mentioned before, all of the intervention modules have both an ebook version and an interactive resource. So it gives you a choice for which way you prefer to access this information. Both are really great. Some people like to do the interactive resource first, and then they'll go back to the ebook to kind of walk through it more slowly, or to go find specific resources. Some people just prefer to read it from the outset. So whichever way you prefer to access this is totally fine. So behavioral contracts is an intervention that we're going to talk about in terms of supporting classroom behavior and engagement, because it's a great intervention that can target both academic skills and behavioral skills, and oftentimes do sort of both of them at the same time. And the resources that we've got here to show you are really going to break down what behavior contracts can look like, and hopefully give you at least an initial idea for how you would put this into place. This little slide right here is showing you where you can download a PowerPoint. That actually, a lot of the slides that I'll present come straight from this PowerPoint. So if you were so inclined and you're thinking, okay, this is a great resource, but I can't get my colleagues to sit down and read a whole module, but we have some PD built into our upcoming, professional development schedule, you could actually download this PowerPoint and present it to your colleagues, because you're going to hear a lot of the content described here tonight. So you could use this as a jumping off point to share the same information with your colleagues, if you prefer to do that in more of a face-to-face format rather than just sharing digital resources. So we're going to look at what behavior contracts are, why they're effective, some of the research that supports behavior contracts, some of the benefits and challenges that we'll want to consider before jumping into this support for certain students, and then looking at a step-by-step approach for implementing behavior contracts and what kind of data we would want to collect as part of this process. And of course, this is going to be a tier 2 intervention. And to kind of start with just a definition of what is a behavior contract. A behavior contract is a mutually agreed upon document or agreement between at least 2 individuals in which one or both individuals agree to demonstrate certain behaviors. It's funny because behavior contract sounds a little legal, and that definition to me, when I read it out loud, sounds a little legal. So to just break it down into a conversational terminology, a behavior contract is an agreement where basically we're going to agree with the student to engage in certain behaviors and potentially to provide certain rewards. So the 3 main components of the behavior contract are specifying the behaviors that are involved. That sounds simple at the outset, but I think in the end, sometimes coming up with exactly what behavior you want to see is sometimes the hardest part of doing a behavior contract. So we'll show you some examples of what good behavioral definitions look like. Coming up with a reward or a reinforcement is important. It's going to provide some motivation for both parties to engage in the behavior contract process. And then a recording sheet, because a behavior contract, as everything around here, is data informed. And so we want to make sure that as part of this process, we have a good way to document data and use that to determine how we should proceed with the contract. So there are a few different kinds of contracts, which I won't go all the way into the minutia. There are one-party contracts, quid pro quo contracts, 2- and 3-party contracts. But the traditional, I think most common one is probably a 2-party contract where 2 people are agreeing to do something where the behaviors of both people kind of intertwine. So for example, a 2-party behavior contract, and you can find this example in the resources on our website or in this module. If you, for example, found in the morning, you're trying to get your child ready to go to school, and you find yourself having to remind that child a lot to be ready for school on time. And it annoys the child, and it just starts this kind of like antagonistic start to the day. So the parent might say, okay, we got to get organized and we got to stop this cycle of frustration in the morning. So we're going to make a 2-party contract wherein my child is going to be ready for school on time without needing any reminders. And so the child is going to be ready for school on time. And I am going to stop pestering my child to be ready on time because I know both of these things are contributing to the problem that we're having in the morning. This is a 2-party agreement because both of us are changing our behavior, right? The child is going to change their timeliness of getting up and getting ready, and the parent is going to change their behavior by, minimizing those kinds of reminders or nagging. And what I like about this example is it shows how, as teachers, students do sometimes things that are counterproductive. They're not particularly helpful for their learning. They might be a little bit obnoxious to their classmates or to us. So we would like for the child to change their behavior. But oftentimes as educators, we sort of need to think about how can I change my behavior to make the environment more friendly to this child, more suitable to meet their needs. Like I can do something here to change as well. And so the 2-party contract is a great example of how we can come to an agreement with the student for how we both can make a change for the positive for our relationship and for the school environment. So if you want to know more about the details between the different kinds of contracts, definitely check out this section about the different sorts of contracts. Here is another way that we can think about breaking down the components of actually writing out the contract. The big components are who, what, when, and how well or how often. So for example, this contract is for a student relative to turning in their assignments. The contract says, I, Charlie, will turn in accurate and complete independent math assignments by the end of independent seat work time with 100% of assignments complete and 80% accuracy over the course of a week. There's kind of a lot to unpackage there. There's a little bit of detail. So at first it seems like, oh, that's a lot of information. But what's really nice is if you think about it, this is crystal clear in explaining what the conditions are where successful completion of these behaviors, you'll know when you get there. And each of these are justifiable, right? We don't want to make a contract where the child is just going to turn in all their homework on time with no consideration towards accuracy, because then, we might be accidentally reinforcing sloppy or incomplete work. So kind of being really mindful about how we can detail those things is important, but also making sure that we can describe them and help the child to describe them as well, and really understand all the aspects of the contract is important. And so later I'll talk about one of the potential drawbacks of a behavior contract is that it's got to be developmentally appropriate. So we need to make sure that whatever contract we come up with is something that can be mutually agreed upon with the child, and that they're really going to understand what all the different pieces of the contract are. So we want to make sure we're kind of taking that developmentally appropriate approach. And so as we think about defining the behavior that we might want to collaborate with the student to change, having good behavioral definitions like that last one is super important. Gen ed teachers are a little bit less familiar with this process, I think, than special ed teachers, because special education teachers often have had to write functional assessment-based intervention plans. They're writing IEP goals. They're writing SMART goals. That's part of the work of a special education teacher, is to do this kind of distilling things down into measurable, objectively observable behaviors. It's not second nature, though, for most folks, and it takes some practice and explanation for how to get from an idea to a really specific behavior definition. So this infographic that you're looking at here is a resource that we've got available in the module to help you come up with a really specific definition. So a really good behavior definition is going to have a label. Maybe it's work completion or academic engagement. That label is going to have a definition where we describe what that behavior looks like. It's going to have a list of examples and a list of non-examples. And those examples and non-examples are going to kind of help us color in between the lines to figure out, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? So if you're looking for more resources to kind of figure out, what are some ways we can write really good behavior definitions, definitely come back to this infographic, because I think it gives you a good kind of baseline starting point for doing that. So good behavior definitions are going to be objective, observable, unambiguous, and this is a great test. Like, if you read a definition, you should ask yourself, if someone just were to walk into my classroom after reading this definition, would they be able to reliably observe and say whether a behavior happened or didn't happen? So making sure we have enough detail, minimizing the room for subjective judgment, and always putting things in terms of an action, what people will do rather than what they won't do. That's a really important aspect of this as well. So then another component, so we've got the behavior on one hand, another behavior or another component of the behavior contract is the reward. And components of the reward that we need to think about is who's going to provide the reward, what the reward is, when it's going to happen, and how much or how well of the behavior reward is going to take place. So for an example, we've got a really detailed listing of what potential rewards might look like for our student Charlie, who's going to provide them, which is going to be the teacher, and in this case, the parent. So this is actually a three-party contract because we've got student behavior, teacher behavior, and parent behavior. The what is those universal reinforcers, the tickets that are used at this child's school, best bucks, which can be exchanged for various other reinforcers. The when is specified, so best bucks being given daily, and then also how often they can use those best bucks to access certain other backup reinforcers. And then how much, so how much of those tickets are going to be provided based on the behavior occurring. And then the last piece is the recording sheet. Oh, also just real quick on the rewards, adults are passably good at coming up with rewards, but if you're trying to come up with a behavior contract for a specific student, this is going to involve sitting down with them and having a few conversations anyways. Ask the students what they want, because oftentimes kids can be pretty reasonable and ask for reasonable things, and sometimes they surprise us for what they might be interested in. And coming up with a good menu of options is a good way to make sure that you've got rewards that are going to seem relevant and important for that student. Okay, next, the data. So we need a good recording sheet to keep track of whether the behavior is happening or not, because A, we want to progress monitor whether the behavior intervention is having the desired effect. But a fundamental thing that we have to do in a behavior contract is we have to know whether or not the student meets the criteria to access the reward. And so we want to make sure we're keeping good notes and records so that we know when that reward can be provided. And if it can't be provided, having that be something that we're mindful of as well. And so what we have in this module is a flexible Google Drive-based recording system that someone could use for measuring, for example, work completion or work accuracy, or potentially both in the context of a behavior contract. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background and research before we go full on into the nitty-gritty of how to actually make this happen. So why are behavior contracts a good idea? They're based on several behavioral principles. One of them is rule-governed behavior, which I think is really interesting. Rule-governed behavior just basically says people are more likely to do something if there's a rule that says they should do it. So knowing that green lights mean go and red lights mean stop, yes, they keep us alive, but just that rule existing in the first place makes people more likely to follow the rule, which is interesting and cool. But also public commitment is a big thing. So I think sometimes when people think they're getting away with something on the sly, it makes it a little bit easier to maybe act in a way that you're not so proud of. But when you publicly commit to something in front of someone that you respect, and hopefully we're talking about behavior contracts between students that respect teachers and teachers that respect students, that public commitment, that agreement that we're going to enter into is a big driving force for creating the motivation for behavior change. If you've ever done like a fitness goal setting thing and you've like told friends like, hey, this year I'm going to try to, run 10 miles a week, or I'm going to try to track my macros for 28 days out of the month. Telling other people about the things we're trying to do is a great way to hold ourselves accountable, and that applies here. And then, of course, positive and negative reinforcement. And this is oftentimes the reward component here. Doing the behavior can help us access things that we like, and accessing those things we like makes it more likely for those behaviors to happen. Potentially, the reward for a behavior contract could be getting out of something that we don't like, and that fits under the negative reinforcement component here as well. And then I think a low-key, maybe hidden aspect of behavior contracts is we're going to be having a lot of conversations, and there's a lot of opportunities for feedback and praise that are embedded in the behavior contract, because we're basically structuring social interactions where feedback is expected. So like sometimes feedback can be a little bit random in the classroom when a behavior is noticed or not noticed. Teachers are busy. You got so many things going on, so it's not consistent always whether or not we're noticing every good thing or not so good thing that a child is doing. The behavior contract is creating an environment where we know we're going to be having that conversation anyways. And so hopefully there's tons of opportunities for behavior specific praise and instructional feedback in terms of how those behaviors are occurring. And so it kind of builds in more opportunities for positive reinforcement, particularly for people that are motivated by those positive social interactions. So I love this bullet. It's so funny to me because it says, simply put, a behavior contract involves an antecedent adjustment that sets the stage for increasing the likelihood that a new, more adaptive or desirable behavior will occur. I don't know, antecedent adjustment doesn't seem that simple to me, but if you're a behavior analyst, it definitely will seem simple. If you're not a behavior analyst, simply put, the behavior contract is going to create this environment where students have more access to positive reinforcement, so it's going to make it more likely that those behaviors occur, and the conditions or the situations where they can get the behavior or that reinforcement are more predictable, so all the better. So what does the research on behavior contracts say? Behavior contracts have a lot of research behind them. There's evidence that suggests that it's effective across the grade ranges for elementary, middle, and high school students. It's effective for students with disabilities and without disabilities, and that it can be effective for increasing or decreasing a lot of different behaviors, which this is wonderful that it has this degree of flexibility, because basically this suggests that you can find an application for behavior contracts when you need to. And so if you're looking for a way to just help kids get their homework turned in on time or just be more productive during independent practice, like this is a great way to go. Because it has that degree of flexibility. Okay, benefits and challenges. The benefits are it's research-based. It's basically free to implement because there's no program or anything that you would need to buy. There's no materials that you need to buy, potentially just any sort of resources that you might need, and requires little time to implement. There's some planning that's needed for sure, but in terms of the actual implementation time, it's pretty minimal. There are some very important challenges to keep in mind, or limitations. One is that we need to make sure that we're choosing and creating a measurable target behavior that helps us to make sure that everything that's happening is like reliable and objective. When a behavior happens or doesn't can easily be identified, and it just cuts out any room that there might be some like hurt feelings over subjective measurement of whether a behavior happened or not. Really important challenge or potential drawback or limitation is that any behavior that we're going to target with a behavior contract absolutely must be within the student's current abilities to do so, and more or less within their control. So what this means is we want to make sure that we're choosing behaviors that a student can do reliably, and that we're not putting them in a position where they're going to be reinforced or punished for things that are well outside their control or things that they just can't really do yet. And that goes along with being developmentally appropriate. And then the last one here is that the behaviors that we're going to enter into agreements on should be agreed upon. So this is really, really important, because what we don't want to do is to create behavior contracts that are tools for coercion. So even if we're coercing a child to do something that we think is good for them, it's just not really good practice to use tools to try to get people to do things that they really just don't want to do. So if you're struggling with the behavior contract, and really when you're doing the planning, you want to make sure that you're entering into a conversation with the student and their family members to choose behaviors that the student can recognize are important and good for them. Because the motivation to do those behaviors can already be set by the recognition that it's an important behavior. And if you can't get there, the first place to start is just helping the student to see the value in some of these behaviors, or maybe choosing sort of a middle behavior that you can agree that's important to work up to things that they're not quite sure that they're into yet. So that's really important to make this like an ethical approach as much as possible, to make sure we're getting a lot of feedback from the students about what behaviors we're going to choose and what that will look like. Okay, so how do we actually do the behavior contract? We've got a step-by-step approach here that involves 9 steps. 9 steps seems like a lot, but the good news is these steps are talked about in detail within the ebook and the interactive resource. So if you're trying to figure out like what is step 3 again, or what does that mean, definitely lean into the available resources to go deep. But in brief, you're going to start by identifying a target behavior. And you're going to meet with people involved, students, colleagues, family members, to agree on what that behavior is going to look like. That conversation is going to include identifying student strengths. So what are we already doing really well? And then how can we further grow through the use of the behavior contract? That's step 3. We're going to write out behavioral objectives and identify rewards and consequences, which are steps 4 and 5. Oftentimes, these can kind of be done at the same time, and they're done in the context of that meeting. To make sure that, the behavior, the reward, and the consequences and the objectives are all things that are mutually agreed upon. And then we're going to determine an evaluation process. That just means like, when are we going to sit down and look at the behavior contract to decide whether or not the criteria has been met and whether we can provide the reward. We're going to do an actual signing of the contract. I would encourage you to think about not just the student signing the contract, but also you yourself signing the contract to show your commitment to the process. And then we're going to just engage in regular data review. This is important, again, to decide whether or not the rewards are going to be provided, but also whether or not we're seeing an increase in the behaviors that are desirable. And then do a regular process to seek input from folks, because we want to make sure that people feel comfortable and positive about this intervention. It is possible with behavior contracts that sometimes kids have a really hard time when they don't receive the reward. And so if we're finding that there's actually some undesired negative consequences or side effects, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to abandon the intervention, but it's definitely something that you want to be able to make adjustments and modifications to reduce any of those maybe potentially undesired consequences or side effects if possible. So the last piece that I want to give you for behavior contracts before we have a little time to explore resources and talk about this intervention is what data we can look at throughout the process to help us drive decision making. So we've got treatment integrity, which is the intervention happening as planned, social validity, which is what do people think about the goals, procedures, and outcomes, and then looking at data to figure out, does our progress monitoring data basically show us that this is working? These don't necessarily happen in this order, but for treatment integrity, once we've got the contract in place and ready to go, we want to make sure that people are following those procedures. So what we have on the module is a very modular checklist that will let us basically write out what those procedures would look like for each person involved. Unlike a lot of interventions, the student is an active participant in a lot of the steps. So having even some fidelity for the student to fill out or fill out for the student is going to be important. But this treatment integrity information is critical because to figure out if the intervention is working, the first thing you got to know is, are we doing it, with consistency? And so that information is going to be filled out using this checklist. What is really, really important, though, is the social validity information, which is going to be happening before the intervention begins and intermittently while the intervention is taking place, which is going to help us to figure out, are the behaviors that we're targeting things that people agree on? Do the procedures seem reasonable? Do I feel good about the rewards and consequences? So this is the way we're going to kind of have information to figure out whether this intervention is really crafted to meet that individual student's needs. And if you'd like a questionnaire version of how to collect social validity, these forms are available to you again in the module as well. And we can also have similar questions for adults, like even asking yourself, like, hey, do I think this is going to work? Does this seem reasonable for me to implement? Is really important because if you yourself don't think it's going to work, what do you think the odds are that you're actually going to implement it consistently and that you're going to see the desired outcomes? And if the answer is, I don't think this is going to work, then we got to figure out what's going to make us all feel more positively about this before we begin. And then lastly, as we're thinking about how to keep track of whether or not the intervention is working, you got to have graphs, right? Graphs are the way that we help us make this information. You got to love a good graph. But not everybody likes making the graph. So if you're looking for a tool to help you put your progress monitoring information into a visual format, you can even copy this data tracker from the module, which has a ton of tools that you can use to create a data collection sheet that'll automatically graph results as you go. And we've also got intervention grids that you can look at to figure out, okay, how can we put this intervention in a systematic way into our school's implementation plan? So you could take these grids and, during the summertime when your school is revising your implementation manual, if you don't already have behavior contracts as a tier 2 intervention, this is an easy way to get it added to your plan. Whether you're at an elementary school or at a middle or high school, those resources are right there for you, and we would love for you to access those.
I will tell you, I think the nice thing about behavior contracts is just the simplicity of how well they work. So like if you can define the behavior, if you can measure it, you can keep track of it. It also works for people to keep track of their own covert behaviors too. So you can use those to make deals with yourself. One of the people I used to work with years ago, she broke up with this person that she deeply loved. And so she started making these like contracts with herself. It was like an individual contract. She's like, okay, I've now set aside this space in my house where I'm not allowed to cry about this anymore. And she kept programming for generalization. I'm like, it was a very behavioral approach to a breakup when she was dating. And I thought it was very successful. But I also love that idea about the self-determined behavior, that like it teaches kids that things are possible. Like I can get there and stay there all day. And I don't know about you, but I play my own mental game sometime with trying to get certain things done, and making that contract with yourself or with another person is often really, really helpful for getting it done. The next thing we're going to switch gears right now. And again, thanks to Mark for presenting. I could listen to you forever. It's just very, very clear and inspiring. So now you're shifting to me. So we're going to talk a little bit about SRSD for writing as an intervention. And whether you do this yourself, or if you're supporting other people, or if you're just listening as somebody that wants to explore this, one of the, I think the strengths of Ci3T is that it focuses at integration across all the tiers. People ask us quite often, can I get a separate list of all the academic interventions, all the behavioral interventions, and all the interventions for social and emotional well-being? And we focus on things that are going to have a really good bang for your buck. So when you think about SRSD, self-regulated strategy development for writing, it's actually applying metacognitive approaches to writing. And then those same metacognitive things can be used in other places. So if you haven't had a chance to check out this module, Phil, this is one of the more recent ones that we've had done. And like the others, there are two pieces to this. If you wanted to go in and just check out the ebook and read it like a digital book, you could do that. And you also have that interactive resource, which is kind of like a tricked out PowerPoint. And remember, you can jump to different places. And, you know, Mark, I thought it was such a good idea tonight to just like pull up that video of the CrossFit analogy, you know, and this, I think having that bank, and Wendy has talked for years about, we need small little bites, little nuggets of things that we can just push play and give that analogy. And as we're thinking about these things right now tonight, I'm encouraging you to think about, who could this be useful for? If not yourself, who else might be on your faculty and staff? So if you were to open up this module, it's going to have that same predictable pattern that you just saw in terms of behavior contracts, and it's going to have very, very similar content. One of the basic things that it starts by doing is explaining what these stages are of instruction. And before we jump into those stages of instruction, I want to clarify what it is and what it's not. Normally, you would be reading about this in the pages of this book or listening to it in that tricked out PowerPoint. But SRSD is not like a comprehensive writing curriculum that's going to take you from start to finish. It is strategies. If you go and you look at kids' academic performance, and if you have the honor of being a special education teacher, you take a very deep dive into how kids are doing in terms of reading, math, and written expression. And written expression often gets left out or gets left as a last piece of an important puzzle in building kids' skills. But what this is doing is teaching specific strategies that are all related to the writing process. So it starts by like teaching kids like these mnemonics. Like one of the first mnemonics that they learn is POW. It stands for plan, organize, and write. So POW. And then the O, the organize piece, there's a bunch of different graphic, graphic organizers and mnemonics and approaches for how you organize different genres. But the whole idea was basically putting some tools in kids' toolkit for the different types of writing that they do. Because many of us who have taught writing know that kids tend to do it not enthusiastically. And a lot of kids do not edit. So it's like one and done, write it, push it out forward. And a lot of kids will actually excuse themselves for writing if they can, because it's not something that they've had a lot of practice with. And it's really, really important that we teach them the joy of writing, because this becomes the major method by which they show what they know after third grade. So SRSD model focuses on this 6-step process, and it's not scripted. There are places to guide you, but it is also interactive and you can kind of move things around. But in general, you start by meeting with kids to develop their background knowledge. So let's say, for example, I wanted to teach kids how to write a persuasive essay, like maybe middle school kids, or a persuasive paragraph if they're 5th grade kids or 3rd grade kids. Then I'm going to develop their background knowledge to think about like something that they might be really passionate about. And it might be something like extended lunch times, or getting able to have at the high school. It could be something like having open campus where you can leave for lunch, but something that's important to them. And so you want to develop their background knowledge to get kind of all the details around things. And then we want to talk to them about these strategies, about how you can discuss with them how to organize it. And I'm going to show you a little bit more detail in just a couple minutes, but you go through this activating prior knowledge on a topic. So whether I'm teaching somebody to write a story or a persuasive argument or some other genre, then I'm going to go through and I'm going to discuss the background, because you're kind of trying to prime the pump to get them to have something to write about, because a lot of it is just like, there's nothing happening here because they don't know what to put down. And then the next step, once you've introduced the strategies, is you're modeling it for them. And this may feel odd initially to teachers when they're doing the modeling part, but you are literally modeling the struggle. And so this is the metacognitive piece. It's like, oh my gosh, I know I got to write this persuasive thing, but I can't, I think I remember the first part is T. I need to get a topic sentence. The next thing is an R. I got to come up with 3 main reasons. I think I remember Miss Oakes talking about, these 3 reasons why it would be good to have extended playground time. And then I have to go through and I have to write a good ending. I think that was, but what's the second E in tree? And so you're modeling for them how to go through that mnemonic. including the struggles and saying things like, I forgot it, but I know I can go check my notes, or I know I'm having a hard time, but I'm going to remember it better the next time. So the teacher that's running this as a small group or doing it whole class is modeling how to use it, and also all the negative things. I think about it a lot, like, and we've talked a lot about the gym tonight, but like, yeah, yesterday morning when I was working out, I had planned to do 5 rounds of something, and it was so cold in the garage, and I kept thinking, oh my God, I don't want to do 5. It's going to take me 25 minutes. I'm so cold. I really am hungry. I'm going to have chocolate chip pancakes when I get inside. And then it's like 3 rounds pass, and it's like, okay, I'm almost there. You can do it. Just close your eyes, count to 25, keep, blah, blah, blah. And by the end of it, it was a painful workout, not because it was a painful workout, but because I was so up in my head. But I did all the right positive talk to finish it. It's the same way with writing it. And then over time, we want to build kids' capacity to memorize what these mnemonics are, so that every time they go to write something, the first thing they can do on their planning page is write POW, plan, organize, and write. And then once they know what the organizational thing is they're going to be writing about, like, am I telling a story, or am I doing something with persuasive writing? That's going to remind me about what the mnemonic is that I need to use. So after I've memorized it, and then basically it's this wonderful dance of scaffolding. So in the beginning, like, you're heavy in there, you're teaching it, it's up on the bulletin boards, it's on a whiteboard, I'm modeling it, I'm checking it, I'm reinforcing it. And I think about it also like potty training for a kid. So in the beginning, there's a lot of things that you do to support aim. Like in the beginning, like you push fluids to try to get, them ready to go to the bathroom. And then you do good modeling for future women in your son's life, like have the toilet seat up, and then throw Cheerios in there. And then as soon as they hit it in the right place, you are clapping and cheering. And if they turn around to look at you, say, no, 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 back over here. And, flash forward, your son's going to be 27, and you're no longer having Cheerios in the potty, and you're not enthusiastically, clapping every time they get it right, but you probably still are thanking him for keeping the seat down when you're done. But so there's this scaffolding of reinforcement, but you're modeling all those things together, acknowledging it. And over time, through all that support, you wane your support as they build this independence. And there's sometimes that you're going to have to step back in when they might have forgotten something, or they're at they got a big block. Many of us in our life will get to help kids write essays to go to college or apply to Duke Tip talent programs. So this strategy is good for a number of reasons. In this module, you're going to go through that same predictable opportunity to access this and share it that Mark just went over. So what is SRSD? What is it specifically for writing? Because SRSD actually can be applied to reading. It can be applied to math. And there's even work in content areas. And so just like Mark went through all these pieces, you will find these things there. And so within each of these stages, you will be able to go and listen to somebody explain more eloquently than I just did, to explain each of those steps through that writing process. And the nice part about it is it can be adapted and modeled. Wendy and I got to do a series of studies back in the day when we were at Vanderbilt, and everything was also funded by the Institute of Education Science. And we got to work with Steve Graham and Karen Harris. And initially, this was all tried mostly with kids with learning disabilities. And over time, it's been tested with kids with behavior challenges. It's been tested with general education communities. But I will tell you that for kids with behavior challenges, the old way of teaching kids how to do this was they used to write all these writing samples, and then you would graph them and say, you're not very good at writing, so I'm going to teach you a strategy. That's how it used to go. Kids with behavior challenges, we very quickly learned that is a terrible idea. So instead, we had them write all those samples. We didn't show them a graph until they started showing improvement. So then we brought a graph to them and say, do you remember these first 5? And it's like, low number of elements. And now that we're using these strategies, it's getting better, because that was reinforcing. Just like Mark was saying earlier, great idea to have graphs. Absolutely. And part of this, we've learned more about the timing of these things. So you are marrying this idea of these mnemonics and strategies for writing instruction with a bunch of self-regulation type things. So you are learning things about helping them to scaffold to learning writing processes and having more positive self-talk, which would ideally generalize to other areas. In this module, you might find this useful. It's just one short little infographic that has 3 goals. It helps kids to learn and master higher cognitive processes, like that whole recursive process of writing, including editing, which is important. It also helps kids be able to hone their own skills and manage their own writing. And it really allows them to be more positive in their own views about themselves as an author. One of the nice sheets, and I think Eric Common put this together with input from several people. This is one of my favorite pieces of the module, this is a very quick overview of all the strategies by skill and by genre. If you were to look at this and think, okay, what are all the different strategies out there? So at the very top, you see where it says POW, plan, organize, and write. It's pick my ideas, organize my notes, write and say and more. Then all the rest are the O's. So like if you're doing like an expository essay, or if you're trying to provide informational text or doing a literary analysis, many districts will actually scope and sequence this out from first grade all the way through high school. This is very, very inexpensive too, and there's a ton of free resources. So as you're thinking about this work, the reason why it is effective, again, is it's putting together these 6 instructional phases that are scaffolded for the different individual learners, and it's very customizable. You can do this individually, you can do it in small groups, you can do this as a tier 1 support. And it allows for a lot of contextualization and individualization. And it takes these things that are often quite complex for kids to do, and it breaks it down into things that are very, very manageable. And because it is inexpensive and effective to use, it's not a bunch of things that are consumable that you have to replace. This is a very elegant library of resources that you could build across a school or across a district to actually empower kids' writing skills. So it might be, for example, you might choose to teach like in 1st and 2nd grade, like maybe story writing, and in 1st grade becomes an important thing. And as you're starting to shift to that guide of using writing to show more about what you know or convince other people, you can move to other types of genres. As I mentioned, it's been tested quite a bit. There's actually a brief on What Works Clearinghouse showing how it's been applied through an exhaustive list of areas. Also, I saw somebody put in the chat this idea about the self-determination skills, because a lot of it is exactly that. It started off by like, I'm going to set this goal. I'm going to take these action plans. I'm going to try these things out. I'm going to realize this part didn't work well for me. And then these things that I did try worked better. And it's really easy to maintain the integrity of this, I think, in part because of the flexibility. Now, in the beginning, when this started coming out, there were not as many mnemonics and strategies as there are now. So the bank is bigger. Some people feel that that's more overwhelming, but in actuality, I think it's probably more of a relief. Like think about kids that are preparing for debates as an activity or engaging in writing progress. This is such a nice structure that they can hang on into. And Wendy, thanks for putting that in the chat. So if you decided you wanted to do this, in this module, we've put together a comprehensive list of places where you can go to get this. So there are websites that have free lesson plans. So like if you wanted to go teach story writing, you can go grab those lesson plans. If you wanted to teach persuasive writing, you could grab those. There's another book that we'll show you in just a little bit. It was written by Karen Harris, who's the lead author, and her husband, Steve Graham. Wonderful people. They actually work with Wendy at Arizona State University now. And there's one of the books is like all about powerful writing. And there's literally just a chapter on each strategy, and they walk you through the whole process. So this has been well tested, well funded. So you can go get those resources. So teacher time is very protected with this approach because it's just learning one at a time. So if you decided you wanted to go try this, and I see that some of you have already done this based on what you're sharing in the chat, we broke down these steps, and these you would find in the module that you have on the Ci3T website, but we're not putting all the lesson plans for the strategies. We want you to go to those other places that are already tried and true. And there's a little 1-page resource guide that will have all the links that you will need. And Wendy's putting some in the chat as well. So the first thing we're going to recommend you do is first think about, for any kid, like, what is the strength of their writing and what are the areas of concern? And you've probably seen a bunch of different things. Some kids are just amazing at throwing a bunch of stuff down there, but it doesn't really connect. Some kids are very parsimonious in their writing. So it's like it's pulling teeth to get them to develop ideas. So think about what are their strengths, great ideas. Maybe they have great word choice, maybe they don't exactly know how to string it together. Then you would think about, how do you want to organize your SRSD intervention groups? Do you want to do some stuff at tier 1 and then build just like you would do with social and emotional well-being? So like, I know some of you are using second step, and then you go deeper at tier 2 or at tier 3. You can do the same type of thing for these writing strategies. You could have certain ones that you teach at tier 1. And then you could also put them into more intensive or individualized supports. You're going to want to have time for people to come together to look at those instructional resources so that they get a chance to do it. I don't think you have to do all of them at one time, but think about your district and state standards to determine what kids are supposed to master in terms of written expression. And those are the ones that I would pull in immediately. And again, it's not intended to replace all of instruction. It's just a piece of it. And then you would do what you do best, like you go train teachers and you would make sure they have the full suite of resources on how to do it. And we've got that available for you in this book. And then you put it in place. And just like any other tier 2 or tier 3 intervention, and we're focusing on tier 2 tonight, we want to get samples of kids writing before you teach them those strategies so that you get a representative sample of what it looks like before you introduce them. And then that way you're monitoring progress. And a big part of it for this intervention is the kids graph their own advancements. So usually when you have these little writing prompts, and you can also, all these resources will have the prompts that you need to elicit that type of writing expression. So for example, if you're working with younger kids and teaching story writing, there's a bunch of line drawings of all different pictures that serve as the prompt to write a story about that particular picture, or a persuasive essay. They have these topics and you can pick one to write about. But you want to have a way to monitor progress. And usually that's done by looking at the number of scoring, like the number of elements that are required for the writing sample, word length, and then overall quality, because more like longer things are not necessarily better. Oftentimes they simply don't make sense. And I'll show you one in just a second. And we want to make sure that in addition to monitoring students' progress, they get a chance to give feedback. So as you are walking through these different aspects of it, all these are mapped out for you, as I mentioned. So you're going to assess their writing strengths, look at things like vocabulary and syntax and context. You might choose, in terms of tier 2 groups, you might decide to have different intervention groups for different genres. And it would be a great idea to involve the family in this as well. When we think about doing anything at tier 2, families should very much be a part of the conversation to get their input as well. We've done these interventions with groups of kids that are 2 to 3 kids. We've also done these individually, and it will depend on the nature of what the student is comfortable. These links that Wendy is putting in the chat, you'll also find under step 3 inside of the ebook, that book called Powerful Writing Strategies for All Students. Like if I was going to buy one book for every teacher in America about how to teach writing strategies, that is the book I would buy. Really well done, super practical, and connects to a ton of resources. And even if I had no money, there are still wonderful resources. If you haven't had a chance to go to the IRIS module website, go there. They've got this whole thing. There's like a challenge. You can work through it. There's great little videos that you can do it, and also great resources available through the Career Catalyst at Arizona State University. I do think it's important to take time to prepare those that are going to lead these groups. And I don't think it always has to be the general education teacher, although it absolutely can be. In fact, one of the studies that we did years ago, we set it up as a tier 2 intervention. So we used screening data to look for kids that had high internalizing and high acting out, externalizing behavior patterns, who were also not doing well in writing. And so we worked in these small groups, and it was in, I want to say I think it was second grade classroom. So Wendy, does that sound right? I'm a little fuzzy on the detail. I'm pretty sure it was second grade. Second and third, yeah. And it went so well. We were supposed to do another study like it to replicate it the next year, but the teachers actually came to us and said, can we just do this for everybody? Because we think all the kids could benefit from it. So we went to our project officer and said, hey, we just had this request. Can we do that? We switched the whole design and it went extremely well. But we want to make sure that they have enough time to understand how to do it. And that whole thing about that high degree of comfort with modeling the different phases and spending enough time. And I want to be really clear. It comes with like 7 lessons. It doesn't mean it's 7 days, because it's going to depend on the kids that you're working with. You might spend 2 to 3 sessions all on the developing background knowledge to learn how to do those things. So it doesn't pace out as a 1 to lesson to 1 session, if that makes sense. So when you're thinking about meeting with kids, when you're thinking about meeting them with them in small groups, it's not a rush. It's not like running through the grocery store, just get whatever the hell you can get and get out before a snowstorm. You are actually taking time to make sure that they've got it, and you want to communicate that plan to people. And then you put it in place. And just like what Mark was talking about, you want to collect information on how the kid's doing before they start, after it's underway, and absolutely making sure that we get information on not just treatment integrity, but also social validity. And I will tell you, we have seen some of the best comments from kids when they have started to learn these strategies. And some of the most hardcore kids that I've had the opportunity to work with through the years, they have said things like, this is so great because somebody finally taught me how to write, because it was like this large, complicated thing. And we also want to get perspectives, not just from the students, but also their families and the teachers themselves. So within this module, you will find like a real detailed list for like, how do I get started? And on this, you'll see that there's the stages as reminders. It walks you through, and this is a pretty detailed treatment integrity form, but it's making sure that there's a column for what the teacher needs to do. And if I was working with 3 kids, then there's a column for each of the other 3 kids. Because just because I bring 3 kids to a table to do an intervention doesn't mean they're all going to have the same experience. So that's why we want to make sure we collect that individual information. We also think it's absolutely critical to get information from the kids before you get started. So we determine, because if you feel motivated, like this could be helpful for you, you engage in it in a very different way. So we want to make sure that that goal alignment is pretty consistent. And also it's helpful to get information from the adults, like from the family perspective, as well as the teacher perspective, to see what might be the bridges and barriers of getting this intervention in place. And because I think it is most powerful, and I love that word because I hear it from Tammy a lot, I think it's important to have good visualizations to be able to show people how this works. So I'm gonna read you one. This is a pre-intervention story probe for Amber. This is I have a spelling in there, so forgive me for that. This is a post for the same child. So on this one, this is the picture. So you see this broken window. And so the pre-prompt, and this was to teach story writing. And this mnemonic is WWW, what equals to, how equals to. And that's like things that are reminders of the who, what, when, where, why. So the pre here was my friend came over. Her name was Charlie. She came over to Bart's. We played until it was time for us to go. Charlie and I asked if we could move together. They said yes for 2 days. Next day, Charlie was mean to me. She didn't share her stuff. Next day, we had to leave. I cried. I said bye. That has literally pretty much nothing to do with the picture, right? It's a lot of words, but it's not pretty cohesive. Look at the post for the same child. One day, a dog was having a birthday party. He invited his dog friends over, and they brought their presents over for the birthday dog. They opened the presents, and then they were done. They had cake. 2 hours later, everyone was going home. The end. So when I think about what those components are in a story, better, true. Now, some people will criticize this intervention and say, well, actually, I think it's just teaching them to might write more words and eventually something will stick. And that's not true. On this one, on the right-hand side, this is for persuasive writing. This is pre and post for a child. Do you think the school rules were necessary? And then the second prompt that they got at post was, do you think the school day should be longer? So do you think school rules are necessary? I think that the playground should have more equipment and have longer monkey bars and let you bring your Nintendo DS. I think there needs to be lunches at 11 so we won't starve to death. There also needs to be new music teacher who won't be so mean to us. There should be bigger space in the art and music room instead of being in a portable. And also there should be lots of homework classes and extra recess. Also, there should be a bigger playground. Also, teachers should not let you to have to read and write summary every night except Friday. Then there should be higher swings and really higher roller coaster on the playground so we can have a good time, and a soda machine in the lunchroom so we don't have to drink milk every single day. Also, there should be concerts like Hannah Montana, Cheetah Girls, One World, and Computer Time. Also inside recess so we can play with the dry erase boards at the end. Again, does that have anything to do with school rules? Not so much. But listen to the same kid after and this is about a 3-week intervention. Should the school day be longer? Same kid. I believe kids should not stay at school longer than what they do now. My first reason is that it would make less playtime. My second reason is that you would have to do more work. My final reason is that you would not get to play with your friends after school. These are the reasons why I believe kids should not stay longer than it is already. Topic sentence, 3 reasons, and an ending, and then they're taught to edit it. So I wanted you to have just a little bit of what it means to translate into those dots. So it's graphing quality, it's graphing word length. And again, longer doesn't always mean better in terms of the number of words, and looking at the number of elements. And if this is something that is not yet in your Ci3T implementation manual, this might be something that you explore as a possibility for next year. Again, it is, I would classify this as something that I think Katie Zimmerman would call like a low effort intervention, not dramatically time consuming, very efficient for kids. Second alternative might be to calendar time to explore another module related to tier 2 or tier 3 that you think is going to be most directly relevant at your school. So when Mark kicked us off with this tier 2 process, that idea of use the data, people have the data. They need to know now how to go through those data, to look at what's happening, to get a list of possibilities that could be useful for kids. And remember, families are not separate from this equation. It's not like we've decided we're doing this with your child. It's bringing them together to make sure we have goals that are meaningful for the teacher, the parent, and the student themselves. So I am hoping that before we wrap up tonight, you will calendar 15 minutes for yourself sometime next week to take a deeper dive into SRSD or check out some of these other tier 2 supports. As we wrap up and move forward tonight, I cannot thank you enough. I know it's like big weather in the Kansas schools, and I know we already have weather happening in the state of Washington as well. And for some of you that are on East Coast time, I know it's really late. So thank you for being here. We will come back together again on March 26th. And on that day, it's all focused on tier 3. And in particular, we're going to spend the majority of our time focusing on kids with acting out issues. We're going to be introducing a new module all on acting out behavior. There's new graphics, there's little videos to guide you through that. There's simulations, and we're going to give some guidance also on supporting kids that have tier 3 needs for internalizing issues. And because typically that would not always be the teacher that's leading those, we're going to talk to you about like how those resources might be situated. So as you move forward and thinking about these different resources that are on deck, we hope that you are finding these useful. I want to give a special praise to Elise, who is here tonight. She's been leading all the module revisions across 6 PIs from 6 different states. It's a complicated order, and just doing it with such grace, I appreciate that. If you found other things tonight that you think, oh, I want to talk more about that, like tell me more about how you use the data to make those decisions about pushing in at tier 2 or tier 3 or staying at tier 1, please do drop into our trainer and coaches calls. These are organized by Grant Allen, and he's at University of Wisconsin. Am I saying that right? Yes, Wisconsin Stout. Did I get that right? Yes. And he is a character and super approachable. I hope you'll come and check some of those out. And we will be back together with you in March again, and then save the last session for April, if you will. April's all about how to close out the school year, how to use your data to make smart decisions about getting ready. And by April, we'll have all the dates for these for next year. And we would encourage you to give people the opportunity to sign up early because I know we will cap at space.